My name is SusanMcLean. I'm a professor in the English department, and in December, a book of mine was just published. It's called Selected Epigrams. It's by Marshall, and it is a collection of my translations of 503 Latin epigrams, which are short satirical poems by the Latin poet, whose name in Latin was Marcus Valerius Martialis, but he's normally known as Marshall in English. He lived around 40 to 104 AD. He came to Rome probably during the reign of the Emperor Nero, and he stayed there for most of his life, just retiring at the very end of his life. He came from Spain, which was a province of the Roman Empire at the time. And he didn't have a lot of money, but he wanted to become a poet. And in order to do that, he needed to find wealthy patrons who could give him enough money to support himself while he was trying to write his poetry. It was more difficult than he expected. Some of the wealthy patrons that he had at the beginning, such as Seneca, were forced to commit suicide by Nero. So he had to keep looking, and he eventually managed to get enough wealthy patrons that he could manage to write his poetry without having to work for a living. And he did okay, but not splendidly. He managed to make enough money to become what was considered a knight at the time. And that gave him special privileges, but it wasn't as if he was born a patrician, which would be the nobleman who really ran Rome. And so the patrons in this time would have been noble Romans who would get prestige by how many clients they supported, who would come every morning to wait on them and to ask if the patron wanted them to do anything for him. So it was a big burden on Marshall to have a lot of patrons he had to visit every morning in order to get the small amounts of money that were handed out at Saturnalia, which was their version of Christmas, birthday gifts, and invitations to banquets, or small amounts of money that were the equivalent of a basket of food, basically, from the wealthy patrons. He wrote a lot of poems, over 1,500, and so I only translated under a third of the total. But I have put together a reading of some of them. Now, I should say that he hasn't had a lot of translators, and that's partly because he's notorious for some very obscene poems that are included among his. Now, my book does include some of those. I'm not going to be reading the most obscene poems, so there will be some racy ones. He used a lot of things that were obscenities in his day, and I tried to find English equivalents, so they're obscenities now too. But those I won't be reading. I will be reading a number on various subjects like patrons and sex and eating and drinking and doctors and marriage and death and so on. So it will be a short selection of the kinds of things that Marshall wrote about. I'll start with some of his poems about patrons. As I say, he hated having to go every morning to visit all of these patrons, and it often involved long treks. So the first poem I'll read is about that. This is number 2.5. There were 12 books, so the first number is the number of the book, and the second one is the number of the poem in the book. May I fall ill if I don't yearn to see you, Decianus, night and day. But you live 2 miles off, and when I must return, the distance turns to 4 miles, not just 2. You're often out. When home, you say you're not. You need free time, your cases must be planned. I don't mind going 2 miles just to see you. It's going 4 to miss you I can't stand. Also, of course, some of the patrons were amateur poets themselves, so they would often be asking for his opinion of their poetry and telling him to be very sincere in his answer. Well, you can guess when you're financially dependent on somebody how sincere you can afford to be with those wealthy patrons. This is number 8.76. Tell me the truth, please, Marcus, you implore. Nothing could be more welcome to my ear.
Whenever you recite your books or plead a client's case, you'd have me be sincere. It's hard for me to turn down your request. So, Gallicus, hear this truth, loud and clear. The truth is not what you desire to hear. In the next one, he is trying to visit a patron who has been out of town, but he keeps getting turned away and finally gives up in disgust. This is number 9.6. Since your return from Libya, 5 days straight I sought to greet you, Afer. On each try, I'm told, he's busy, he's asleep. Enough. You don't want greetings, Afer? Then goodbye. The clients usually gave little birthday gifts to their patrons on the patron's birthday in the hope that the patron would give them big gifts on their own birthdays. This is about that. It's called 9.53. I wish to give a trifling birthday gift, Quintus, which you forbid imperiously. I must obey. Let's do what both would wish, what pleases both. Let you give one to me. And then he complains about the poor remuneration he was getting from some patrons for all these morning visits. He was forced to wear a toga on the morning visits, and togas were quite expensive. So here he's complaining that he's not getting enough to pay for his toga. It's 9.100. For 3 denarii, you bid me come to pay you morning calls in formal dress, then stay beside you, walk before your litter, and call upon 10 widows, more or less. My toga may be threadbare, cheap, and graying, but bosses, it costs more than you are paying. Banqueting was almost an art form in ancient Rome, and the patrons managed to make it worth the client's time by often inviting their clients to fancy banquets. But there are all sorts of things that can go wrong in a banquet, and so Marshall has written a number of poems about those things. In the next poem I'm going to be reading, he alludes to the kind of mushrooms that Claudius ate. The Emperor Claudius was poisoned by his wife Agrippina in a dish of mushrooms. This is 1.20. What folly is this? In front of crowds of guests, you gobble every mushroom on the plate. What curse, Caecilianus, suits such greed? May you eat mushrooms such as Claudius ate. Now, I should tell you, all of these names of patrons that he's making fun of are pseudonyms. They are not the names of his real patrons. He occasionally mentions the real patrons by addressing an epigram to them, and that's a compliment to them, implying that they would share his opinion of whatever he's saying. But when he's making fun of somebody, it's always an invented somebody. It would be too dangerous for him to make fun of an actual patron. The next one, 1.28, is about people who drink a lot. Whoever thinks a Sarah stinks of last night's wine is wrong. He drinks till light begins to shine. Now, the banquets would start in the middle of the day, so this is somebody who's a really serious drinker. And in the next one, it alludes to Thyestes. Thyestes was someone who was served his own sons in a banquet by his brother. And supposedly the god Apollo was so appalled at watching a man unknowingly eat his own sons that he fled. He was the sun god at this time. So this is 3.45. Whether Apollo fled Thyestes' dinner, I can't say. Ligurianus, yours we flee. The feasts are lavish and superb, but nothing can please when you recite your poetry. I don't want turbot or mullet when we sup. I don't want mushrooms or oysters. Just shut up. So sometimes when your patron wanted to show off his own poetry, it was not a pleasure. And then there were people who had a nasty reputation for the effect of some of their dinners. This is number 4.69. You always serve such fine wine, Papillus, but rumor makes us pass it up. They say this flask has widowed you 4 times. I don't believe it, but my thirst has gone away. There was also often the case that the patrons would be drinking fine wines themselves, but serving really foul wines to their guests because the foul wines were cheaper. And so Marshall comments on that situation. 4.85. We drink from glasses, Ponticus, you from stone. So we can't see your wines unlike our own. So he's on to the patron and why the patron isn't using a see-through glass. And then there are people who are sort of professional parasites. They would go around from dinner to dinner to dinner because they were too poor to feed themselves. And this next one alludes to that. 5.47. He swears he never dines in. That's no line. If not invited, Philo doesn't dine. Another kind of thing that Marshall encountered was the patron who would keep getting up in the middle of a banquet to change to a whole new costume to show off his fancy wardrobe. So this is about that. It's number 5.79. 11 times you rose at dinner, Zoilus, to change the outfit you were dining in, so that your sweat-drenched clothing wouldn't cling or subtle drafts disturb your rested skin. Why don't I sweat at dinner as a rule? Having one outfit keeps me mighty cool. And some people, even though they had a lot of tables, would show off by, instead of using tables, having page boys bring all of the food around. Here he comments on that. It's number 7.48. Although he owns about 300 tables, Annius uses page boys in their place. The platters run right past, the dishes speed. You fine lords, keep such banquets for yourselves. A walking dinner puts me off my feed. And then there was the experience he sometimes had of being invited to a dinner where he didn't know anybody, where he felt uncomfortable. So this is 11.35. You ask 300 people I don't know, and then act astonished, fume, and moan because I won't come too when I'm invited. Fabullus, I don't like to dine alone. Another thing that some people know about ancient Rome is that people went to the public baths. Some of the public baths had separate times for the men and for the women, but others were co-ed public baths, so everybody would be in there naked together. And he wrote a number of poems about that. This is the first one, 1.23. You ask to dinner none but those you've bathed with. The baths yield all your guests. I used to brood, Cotta, about why I was not invited. I know now, you disliked me in the nude. And there was a small charge to use the public baths. And so a very enterprising slave who collected the payments for using the baths clearly found a way to charge a little more in this next one, 2.52. Dacius counts his bathers well. He made Busty Spitali pay for 3. She paid. He's charging her separately for each breast, in addition to herself, because she's so busty, implying that she's taking up so much room, she ought to pay for 3. People also, if they were rich enough, had baths in their own homes, but Marshall complains sometimes that they don't heat those baths well enough. So here he's answering a request from a patron, and it's 2.78. Where to keep fish in summertime, you ask? Your so-called heated baths would suit the task. And here he's talking to a woman. This is 3.51. When I admire your face and legs and hands, you'll like me better nude, you always tease. Yet, Gala, you won't bathe with me in public. Am I the one you fear will fail to please? Now, the Romans had all kinds of attitudes about sex, that some of which were different from our own, some of which were like our own, adultery was something that was forbidden by law. And so you could get punished if you were a convicted adulteress. Men got away with adultery a lot, but women would be forced to wear a toga, which is something that women only wore if they were prostitutes. Now, the reason prostitutes were required to wear togas is so that nobody would mistake them for honorable women. So they had to wear it, but if you were a convicted adulteress, you had to wear one too. So he makes a lot of jokes about adultery, but also about incest, about prostitution, about pederasty, because of course people owned slaves. So a lot of Romans were in fact bisexual. They would be having sex not only with women, but also with slave boys. And that was perfectly accepted. We think that Martial himself was gay, because he has a lot more poems about sex with slave boys and hardly any about sex with slave girls. Now, he does have a lot about using female prostitutes, and we don't know whether that's just a stance he's adopting. He also has some in which he pretends that he's married, but we have no evidence that he was ever married. So the first one is about adultery. This is 1.74. He was your lover, Paula. It's a fact you could deny. Look, he's now your husband. Can you still call it a lie? So he's implying she's confirmed the fact that it was an adulterous affair by marrying her former lover. And then there's one about incest. This is 2.4. How doting is your conduct toward your mother, and Ammianus, how she dotes on you. You call her sister, and she calls you brother. But why do naughty names attract you too? Why aren't you happy being what you are? Do you suppose that this is harmless fun? It's not. A mother who would be a sister is not content with being either one. And I told you that prostitutes wore togas, but so did convicted adulteresses. This is about that. This is 2.39. You give a known adulteress gowns of violet and scarlet. Give her a gift she's merited, the toga of a harlot. Sometimes when noble Romans were sent to govern provinces, they were able to make a lot of money from the local people through extortion. But usually they left their wives behind when they went on these kinds of excursions. So this is about a man who brought his wife along. .56. The Libyans, Gallus, call your wife bad names. She's charged with boundless greed. Without a doubt a foul reproach. Those tales, though, are sheer lies. She isn't on the take. She just puts out. So, yes, instead of extorting money from the locals, she's sleeping around with them. Or here's another one about a man and his wife. It's 3.26. None Candidus but you has land and cash. No other owns gold plate and murrine stone, or vintage Caecuban and Massic wine. Talent and judgment, too, are yours alone. You alone have it all. I don't demur. Except your wife, for everyone has her. Or here's a man who divorced his own wife, and then after he divorced her, he started having an affair with her. This is 3.70. Aufidia's spouse before, you're now her lover. Your former rival is the one she wed. Why want her not as your wife, but another's? Does it take fear to make you rise in bed? I said that Martial himself writes a lot about having sex with his own slave boys. Typically, it was considered perfectly acceptable for an adult male Roman to have sex with boys, but not with adult men. So, interestingly, once a slave boy started to get a beard on his face, he was no longer considered eligible for this kind of relationship. And so a lot of boys would start claiming they were getting their beard in before they actually were, as a way of getting out of having sex with their master. This is 4.7. Why, Hyllus, withhold today what yesterday you gave? so lately kind, and now so cold. Yet now you plead your beard, and years, and hair. What a long night, if one night makes you old. Why mock me? Hillis, tell me in what way did yesterday's boy become a man today? And I said there was a law against adultery. So some people, if they were going to get prosecuted, would get married fast. This is 5.75. A law forced Lilia into wedded life. So Quintus, she's rightly called your lawful wife. Or this is 12.20. Themison has no wife, and never missed her. Fabullus, you ask why? He has his sister. And they even had gay marriage back in those days. Not that it was legal, but that people did it anyway. So this is about a gay marriage. 12.42. Bearded Callistus wed rugged Aphor, the way a virgin usually is mated. The torches shone, his face was veiled in orange, the ritual words were said, the dowry stated. Rome, is this still unsatisfactory? Maybe you're waiting for the bride to have a baby? Usually when Marshall is talking about marriage, he has very negative things to say about it. And as I say, he was probably gay himself and never married, but also it is a typical source of humor for men to joke about how bad marriage is. So he makes a lot of jokes about that. One of the reasons a lot of Romans would get married is if the potential wife was rich, they had a strong incentive to marry her to get her money. And if she was rich and sickly, they might get the money and get rid of her pretty fast. So in this one, when a cough is referred to, tuberculosis is implied. 1.10. Gemellus wants to marry Marinella. He burns, implores, brings gifts, won't be put off. Is she so pretty? No, there's none more homely. What makes her so appealing then? Her cough. Or some women caught on to this, and they would pretend to be sick. So in this one, 2.26, a woman's pretending to be sick. Bithynicus, since Nivea breathes in gasps and coughs hard, often sending spittle flying into your lap, you think you've got it made? You're wrong. She's playing up to you, not dying. 4.24. She's buried every friend she's had in life. I wish Lycoris would befriend my wife. He was often told that he could make a lot of money by marrying a wealthy wife, but he didn't like the idea one bit. This is 8.12. You ask why I don't want a wealthy wife? To be her wife is more than I could bear. A wife should be below her husband, Priscus, for man and wife to be a proper pair. Sometimes, of course, people would not only make money off marriages, but have a suspicious number of spouses die on them, leaving them a little richer every time. So this is about that situation. 8.43. Crestilla buries husbands, Fabius wives. Each waves the funeral torch at the marriage bed. Pair up the winners, Venus. The result will be that both will share a bier instead. A bier in this case is a platform for carrying the corpse out for burial. So he's implying they'll bump each other off simultaneously. Or 10.8. Paula would marry me. I'm disinclined. She's old. If she were older, I'd change my mind. Or 10:16, Aper shot his wealthy wife, an arrow through her heart during a game of archery. At gamesmanship, he's smart. Or 10:43, you've buried 7 wives now in your field. Phalaris, no one's land can top that yield. Needless to say, since Marshall's life was constantly searching for money, he writes a lot about money. Money in various forms. He's constantly getting loans from patrons, and the understanding was that when he borrowed the money, he wouldn't be expected to repay it, so a loan is a way to save face. Instead of just giving money handed to you, you pretend it's a loan. Another way to get rich is by buttering up old sick people in the hopes that they will leave you a lot of money in a legacy. So he writes about all of these kinds of ways of getting money in ancient Rome. This is 2.30. I chanced to seek a loan of 20,000, which one could give away and not think twice. The man I asked, a trusted friend of old, whose strong box whips up riches in a trice, said, "Be a lawyer. You'll make piles of cash." I asked for money, Gaius, not advice. And this is 2.65. Why is Salianus looking sadder? For no small cause, you say. I've lost my wife. Oh, monstrous crime of fate. What rotten luck. Has she, rich Secundilla, lost her life? Who brought a dowry of 1,000,000, too? I'm sorry things turned out like that for you. Clearly, he wishes that I hadn't been so lucky, not that he's feeling sad for him. Or somebody would try to borrow money and when turned down, borrow something else that was worth even more. That's what this is about. This is 4.15. Caecilianus, when you asked me lately to lend you 1 grand for a week, I said I'm broke. But now, because a friend is coming, you seek a dish and serving tools instead. Are you a fool? Am I, my friend? When I've denied you 1 grand, will I give you 5? So he thinks if he did lend the platter and the serving tools made out of silver, they would go to the local pawn shop or be sold off very quickly. He also had some trouble getting people to want to buy his book. Now, people didn't have a copyright in this day. The only way he would make any money from selling his books is by getting a small kickback from the seller, if he managed to sell a few copies. But he'd be expected to give free copies, which were very expensive to produce, to patrons. This is 4.72. Quintus, you'd have me give my books to you. I've none, but Triffin's shop has a supply. Should I pay cash for trash and buy your verse? I'm no such fool, you tell me. Nor am I. Auctioneers were very looked down on in ancient Rome because often, of course, they were selling slaves. And so in this one, an auctioneer is trying to sell a prostitute, and he thinks that people assume that she's got a venereal disease, so to show that she doesn't have one, he kisses her in public. But you'll see how that turns out. 6.66. When Gellianus, the auctioneer, was selling a girl just now of none too good report, the kind who sits in the middle of Subura, for quite a while the bids had fallen short. Wanting to prove that she was clean, he pulled her near against her will and kissed her 2, 3, 4 times. What resulted from that kissing? One who'd bid 600 then withdrew. And of course, when some old rich man was dying, people would constantly be stopping by with presents. So here's his comment on that, 8.27. Gowers, you're old and rich. Those who stop by with gifts, could you but know, are saying, die. And he himself, of course, would hope for legacies from rich old men. So here is a chance where he thinks he's going to get one. It's 10.97. As a pyre was built of flammable papyrus, the weeping wife bought myrrh and spice to strew. When undertaker, bier, and grave were ready, Numa named me his heir, and then pulled through. Or 11.67. Alive, you give me nothing, saying you'll bequeath me more. Maro, if you're no fool, you know what I am hoping for. Or this one, 12.10. Although worth millions, Africanus hunts a legacy. To many, fortune gives too much, enough to nobody. Because he was a writer, and there was no copyright in this time, it was very easy for people to plagiarize by buying a copy of his books and then reading his poems in public and claiming that they had written them. So he was pretty annoyed about this, and he wrote a number of poems in which he was protesting people claiming that his own poems were written by them. This is 1.29. Rumor reports that you recite my books in public, Videntinus, as your own. Call them mine, and I'll send you them for nothing. Buy me out if you want them yours alone. Or this one, 2.20, Paulus buys verse, which he recites as his. For if the things you buy aren't yours, what is? Here's somebody who is an amateur poet. 8.20. You write 200 lines a day, but don't recite. Varus, you are wise, if none too bright. So he's implying that to write so much when you're so bad doesn't make any sense at all. 8.69. Viscera, you admire the ancients only and praise no poets but those here no more. I beg that you will pardon me, Viscera, but pleasing you is not worth dying for. He tended to look down on doctors and think that seeing a doctor was the next best thing to a death sentence. Here's 1.30. Dialis was a surgeon. He's an undertaker now, starting to practice medicine the best way he knows how. Or 9.96, Dr. Herodes took a patient's scoop for wine by stealth. When caught, he said, "You nitwit, drinking's ruining your health." So he's stealing it for the patient's own good. Here's 10.77. Maximus, nothing Carus did was naughtier than dying of fever. It, too, was unfair. Harsh, heinous fever. If you'd just been milder, he should have been saved for his physician's care. So, obviously, that's a fate worse than death, to be treated by a doctor. When people got sick, but they recovered, they had get-well gifts that all their friends were supposed to bring them. So this is about that practice. 12.56. 10 times or more a year, you're taken ill, but Polycharmus, we're the ones who suffer. Each time you rise, you ask your friend for presents. For shame, this time get sick and don't recover. Martial was very good at insults, and so a lot of his funniest poems are actually inventive ways to insult somebody. This is 1.83. Manea, your lapdog licks your lips with his tongue. It's no surprise that a dog likes eating dung. That's implying that Manea is performing oral sex on somebody. Usually when he's making a joke about somebody having a really disgusting mouth, that's the implication that he's driving out. Or 2.38. What yield does my nomentum farmstead bear? Linus, I don't see you when I am there. Or 3.80. Apicius, you don't badmouth anyone. Yet rumor says you have a wicked tongue. So again, the implication of oral sex is there. And of course, one can always make jokes about death. So here is one, 2.80. Fannius, fleeing his foes, chose suicide. That's crazy. So as not to die, he died. Or 4.58. You mourn your mate in private. It appears, Gala, that you're ashamed you have no tears. Or, this one actually isn't funny. He had a little slave girl that he owned who died just before she turned 6. And he was devastated. He wrote several poems about the death of this little slave girl. So even though he did make fun of people pretty much for a living, it doesn't mean he didn't have a heart. And this is his elegy for the little dead slave girl. 5.34. To you, my parents, Fronto and Flacilla, I commend this girl, my darling and delight. Don't let the dark shades and the huge-mouthed hellhound fill my small Erotian with fright. She would have known the chill of 6 midwinters had she survived by just as many days. Now let her lisping mouth chatter my name to her old guardians as she romps and plays. Let no hard turf hide her soft bones. Earth, do not press her harshly. She was light on you. Well, that's it. Thanks. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And if anybody has any questions about this project, I'd be glad to answer it. Yes, Liz?
Yeah, I'm curious as to whether we have any way of knowing that the patrons knew who he was writing about.
He writes about the fact that he will often get pressured by people to reveal who is that pseudonym about, and he said, I'm not telling. So he refuses ever to reveal who the real target is, and he insisted, in fact, that he was not picking on real people, because of course it would be very, very dangerous to pick on real people when he's so dependent on them for his finances.
Exactly.
Is there anybody else who has a question? Yes, Maureen?
I have 2 quick ones. One, why do you think his poems haven't been translated before? And 2, I have a question about the rhyming element.
Mm-hmm.
Did you try to stay authentic?
Okay, the first question, they have been translated before. But a lot of people have not translated a lot of them or put out a book of translations, because if you're going to do Marshall, you can't just ignore all those obscene poems. And even if people wanted to translate them, and some people did, it was hard to get a publisher who would publish them if they did translate them. And so there was a tendency to translate them, but to euphemize them, to tone them down so that they weren't so dirty. And so people have written translations, but not many people have written accurate ones before this time. And in terms of rhyme, I have to confess, Latin poems did not rhyme at this time. I added the rhyme. But the reason I added it is that they were metrical poems. And in English, if you're going to do a funny poem, the punchline works a lot better if it rhymes. And so for effectiveness, for getting a laugh, the rhyme is very useful. And he didn't have rhyme as one of the options he could use. He had to just use the meter to make it funny and save the punchline for last. But I find that rhyme really makes it work a whole lot better than it does. It's really hard to do this just in free verse. It just comes across as a joke and not a poem. And so if you're going to make it clear that they were poems, and very well-written poems, you have to do something that shows that. Any other questions? Jim?
You said there's what, 1,500 of them?
Over 1,500, yeah.
And it was 2,000 years ago, or what, close to that. Is it possible that this is a collection of several poets? I mean, is there anything in
No, he was very well known, and he was famous. He really did get spread throughout the Roman Empire in his own lifetime. He was that famous. So nobody would dare to claim that something was by Marshall if it wasn't by Marshall.
So did they have the scrolls, or did you say the scrolls?
Oh, no, they haven't survived as scrolls, but they got written down so many times that they got passed down through the years. When you make a lot of copies of something, the chances that one of those copies will survive long enough to get written down by somebody later on goes way up. And he was so popular in his lifetime that there were a lot of copies. Yes?
But one of the disadvantages would be then that a lot of the scrolls or copies were saved in monasteries. And it's probably obvious that no monastery would want to save his work. So it's particularly interesting, I think, that it survived.
It's amazing.
So many other manuscripts
Oh,
did
yeah.
not.
It's amazing that so many of them did survive. Yeah, we've actually got 15 books of his poems. I only translated from 12 of the books. I skipped the first 3 books because they were very technical kind of things. He was sort of like a Hallmark card writer at the beginning. He was writing little poems to be attached to gifts at Saturnalia. And so his first couple of, well, 2 of his first 3 collections were little poems to attach to gifts. And then his very first collection was about the kind of shows they had at the opening of the Colosseum, which wasn't called the Colosseum back then, but it's just all about, well, first we saw this, and then we saw that, and then we saw this, and it's not necessarily terribly funny. So I stuck with the funny ones when I was trying to translate. Jerry?
Was he his own publisher? You said the patrons would ask for like a book. Did he have to sit down and produce it?
Oh, no. He would pay somebody to copy it out. So he'd have to have a slave or an employee copy the book if he was going to give one to his patron. That way is why they were so expensive to produce. So he'd expect some big gift from the patron to compensate him for the cost of copying out the manuscript. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming. And help yourself to refreshments at the back.